steps that we need to take while starting to think about and developing our theory of change. Just to give you a broad overview of how you start working on a theory of change, you first look at identification of your main goal. And like we've discussed in previous videos, you start identifying preconditions or outcomes that you would need to achieve in the short and medium term to actually lead to your long-term impact. This then takes us to the backwards mapping process, where we start from the goal, identify different outcomes and preconditions that need to come before achieving that goal, and then which leads us back to our program and the activities that we need to take for that. We then look at each outcome, and we'll be going through a couple of case studies to do this process, but we look at each outcome and then start identifying the indicators we'll use to actually assess the achievement of those, or if not, not only the achievement, but by how much we are achieving the outcomes that we're expecting. Once that's done, we start looking at the interventions needed to make these outcomes happen. And then we kind of move away from the abstraction of boxes and the graphical representation, and build a narrative or a qualitative piece on explaining the theory of change. So let's just jump right in to the first step of identifying goals and outcomes. And I think we saw this in the last couple of videos, that it's very important in a theory of change to establish the how and why, as to why one thing is going to lead to the other, or why for say, for example, for learning outcomes to happen, attendance needs to improve, student engagement, teacher methodologies. There are a lot of things that need to happen for that. So just to reiterate, it's important to talk about how different outcomes are linked. So let's look at this example and this case study. The goal of the organization was to ensure that domestic violence survivors, women, get long-term employment at livable wages. Now, for that, few preconditions that the organization deliberated on was, one, they should attain coping skills to deal with the trauma that they've been with, and to actually try and get into mainstream sort of work. The next would of course be that for the jobs that the organization is trying to provide, they should have marketable skills in jobs. For example, whether it's working in retail, whether it's working in banking. So looking at marketable skills, and of course to sustain in jobs, to have appropriate workplace behavior. So this is what kind of the first stage of theory of change is, to identify a long-term goal and to talk about the few preconditions that must come. Very important is also to recognize assumptions. So now if you look at A, B, C and D, we have kind of thought, or the organization has thought about the assumptions that we're making while thinking about these outcomes and backwards mapping. So one, of course, the assumption is that there are jobs available. People are willing to hire women or domestic survivors in non-traditional skills. There's a big assumption that by participating in these trades, they're more likely to get higher wages. If you look at survivors attain coping skills, a big assumption is that it's not just employability skills, but they need more in terms of soft skills, in terms of confidence building, etc. And of course, a huge assumption is that women will be able to learn based on their backgrounds. Maybe they don't have such high education attainment, they haven't worked in the formal sector before. So a big assumption is also that they can learn non-traditional skills and compete in the marketplace. So just to kind of look at stage one or step one, the first thing to do is, within various stakeholders in your organization, is to discuss, agree on, and get very, very specific on the long-term goal. I would also like to bring in here a whole concept of, a lot of times organizations are doing a multidisciplinary taking a multidisciplinary approach where they're working in a community on education, health, livelihoods. They're looking at a holistic village development program, and then the long-term goal comes as quality of life. Now the problem here is and we'll see this later, is when we use such broad terms, it becomes very difficult for us to actually measure what is quality of life. How are you going to measure it? So it's important to say that the community has access to healthcare, or has a strong social how do I say, a good sort of social system in place for them to get their basic needs. Alright, sorry for that, but just to say that try and be very, very specific about your long-term goal. Alright, the next, like we discussed, is we have to show preconditions that must come before the long-term goal. What we've done here is about identifying assumptions, and then you continue illustrating how these long-term goals are linked to intermediate ones. So let's look at what brings us then to the whole process of backwards mapping and connecting outcomes. Now, what is important to also realize is that once you make your theory of change, it's not like you can kind of use it for the next 10 years, right? A theory of change is a very iterative process, and a lot of times the debates and discussions you continuously have with stakeholders is the most valuable component. So let me explain how this whole backwards mapping process goes, and then come back to how these might change. So moving on, one of the ways that they would know workplace behavior and have marketable skills is that they serve internships. They get into the formal workplace. And in terms of them attaining coping skills, they should know how to deal with their issues, for which counseling and practical support should be offered, or they should have access to a counseling and practical support, and they should have like this peer group or peer support and access to peer-to-peer counseling and attend them regularly. In terms of women serving internships, of course, one of the things that the organization says is that women attend training both for the technical skills as well as about what's expected in the workplace, as well as employers are educated on how to use interns on actually absorbing women domestic violence survivors into the workplace. For all of this to happen, women should enroll in the program. And for women to enroll in the program, one of the things they identified was women were not very keen on joining the program because they had children and they needed childcare support, and a lot of times they had such disbelief in themselves, such low self-esteem that they were not ready to attend, commit. So very important is that they in terms of the backwards mapping was that women should attain regular childcare and they should be ready to commit and attend the program. For this to happen, women should have heard about the program, and then of course it brings us back to what our program is doing. So if you look at this, we again identify a couple of assumptions. One is that for women to enroll, there needs to be appropriate screening, because you can't take all domestic survivors. There has to be a certain sort of cadre of women you're looking at, or a certain profile. Also, big assumption is about that they will be interested in and they will actually send their children to childcare. And of course, before even being ready to commit and attend, they need to also be interested in something like this. So, and if you actually deep dive into this diagram, I'm sure there are a lot of other assumptions that will, crop up when you look at your backwards mapping process. So coming back to, the idea of, now this is how the organization started with their theory of change. And, while they collected data, while they started implementing the program, there were a lot more elements that came up. So about attending traditional classes, one thing that came up was transportation costs was very expensive. So, they had to start looking at how they could also help women attend the program, or how they could probably have a residential program. So, the most integral part of a TOC is also kind of always re-looking at it, always kind of revising it based on actual ground realities and your implementation processes. Moving on now, just let's look at the first long-term goal as well as the preconditions. So now, and we'll be doing a very exhaustive session on indicators. But I think what you need to take away from this slide is that each outcome, or if you say quality of life, going back to that, how are you going to measure this and we learn about it later, about SMART goals, about being very, very specific and actually being able to measure something in a quantitative way rather than just qualitative. So if you look at long-term employment, so they've said they should remain in jobs for 6 months. In terms of attain coping skills, they could be they're going to have self-reported scores on mental well-being. We will look at number of graduates to see how many, and with their scores as to how many have achieved marketable skills, and successfully completed internships. So by collecting data on each of these things, we can actually see we can measure that survivors have attained coping skills. They are we're reaching our targets. We have a high number of graduates, and internships are being successfully completed. But do these things really lead to women or to our participants remaining in jobs for 6 months? So when we start collecting data, we'll actually be able to see trends in what is leading to what. And again, this is a stage where you're really trying to microscopically go into your assumptions or into your outcomes to measure the changes that are happening. In terms of this phase, we are actually looking at how effective are our different activities, or how is our implementation, what are we achieving what we set out to do. If you look at this, you now see there are numbers in the triangles. So these signify the events or the activities that must happen. These are the interventions. These are highlighted as interventions. So if you look at the dotted lines, these dotted lines means you need an intervention, and these solid lines mean that it would automatically happen. So for example, when you're talking about attend trainings and for expectations in the workplace, this will only happen if there is an intervention. Or for example, once survivors know about and have appropriate workplace behavior, these things need to happen through an intervention for our goal to be achieved. So what we basically need to do is really spot check as to where do we need to intervene, which outcome or which sort of outcome and precondition needs an intervention. So if you look at this, women, for all of these things to happen, for them to attend peer-to-peer counseling, for them to get practical support and counseling, or attend non-traditional skills classes. For all of this to happen, we need different interventions. We need an employer education program. We need a training program. We need a training program here. So, what I'm trying to say is, for women to enroll in the program and for this to automatically happen is not possible without interventions. So, we start with, let me go back to our process, where we are starting with a long-term goal. We have preconditions identified, and then we go further and do a backwards mapping process. We then look at all the assumptions while we are making this causal pathway. We then start looking at how we are going to measure the achievement of all these different outcomes. And once we have this map, we'll start looking at how we need to, or where we need to intervene, or where we require an intervention for these outcomes to take place. And finally, once we kind of have this pictorial diagram, we start looking at actually, describing what we've tried to do. So you're looking at, the context, the target group, and where all we're playing a role in bringing this change. We are looking at all the different interventions that need to take place. We talk about the long-term goals and why our initiative or our interventions are going to lead to that. We also, while we are looking at this, diagrammatic representation, it's also important for stakeholders to understand why intermediate goals are important for within themselves, also for the long-term goal. And like I mentioned, we always need to answer the why and how, and give justifications and state the assumptions we're making while building our theory of change. So I think what we basically, kind of from this video should take away is the whole backwards mapping process. Can you start with a particular goal? Let's take our case example where the goal was improved learning outcomes among students, and can we work backwards to identify all the preconditions. So I'm going to leave the participants with this for now. Please do look at the case study example, and before watching the next video where I kind of put that case study into a TOC perspective, try and develop one of your own, and then let's see how much it matches, what kind of what's something new that you bring to the case study, and we will look at how, or rather it will explain or illustrate how most TOCs will look different based on the context, stakeholders, or development practitioners who are doing them. So thank you.